Hey there, citizen planners. Welcome to What's the Plan, the show about urban planning where we talk about being a planner in the 21st century. I'm your host and local planner, Rashidul Hassan Deepan, and my guest today is Seth Rivard, the city manager of Poolesville, Maryland. Seth received his undergraduate degree in history and political science. He also has a teaching certificate at the undergrad level and a master's degree in public administration with concentration on land planning and development. And how's this for a plot twist? Just about 9 months ago, as of the date of this recording, he was my supervisor. As far as boss and employee relationships went, Seth and I had a very collaborative one. Coming from different walks of life, we were able to find a rhythm to working together while approaching a planning issue from two different perspectives. Plus, it's fair to say we enjoyed each other's company when talking about urban planning in the abstract. Today, you will be privy to one of those conversations. However, for your convenience, I try to set a structure to our conversation and reduce the meandering thoughts that might follow. But you'll see that we still manage to go off on certain tangents. It was a good conversation, but I would say we are still trying to find a rhythm and adjust ourselves to these podcast settings. We eventually did find our rhythm as we loosened up a little bit close to the end of the episode. However, we covered certain things that I believe were important. Not surprisingly, we talked a little about COVID 19. We had an honest conversation about the challenges and stress that come in working in local government. Also, if you're a zoning ordinance nerd, you're in luck. We talked about writing codes. A lot. If any of my friends from grad school is listening to this episode, they would know for sure how I was not particularly a fan of zoning ordinances. But here we are. Funny how life takes you in unexpected directions. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm figuring out this COVID 19 era of podcasting. It is a learning curve, and I can only hope it gets better. Both the pandemic and the podcast. So put on your headphones and enjoy the show, citizen planners.
Let me know when we're recording.
Well,
Here we are.
we're recording.
Sounds
Here we
good.
All right. So, um, as part of the pre-conversation, I mean, look, this job, nobody told you how stressful it can be sometimes,
Hmm.
and how much of an impact it can have on your personal life in a way. But yeah, I think it's part of the learning curve. Just so that you know, I always do an introduction, but that has nothing to do with this portion of the
Sure.
interview. I just do it,
Separately.
separately and just kind of weave into this.
Okay.
Uh,
So I guess, how do we want to begin? Where do you want to go?
well, I think let's start with the origin story. What did,
Sure. The question you posed to me essentially was, where I grew up in my background and that path. And from a planning perspective, that's a great question because it really shaped why I'm in the planning field. I grew up in a town called Bay City, Michigan. It's a very grid style, urban pattern. Every street in one direction starts at first and goes to 42nd, something of that nature. And then it starts by the presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, so on and so forth. And, as you get towards the Civil War, they sprinkle in some Civil War generals and move out a little bit further. And, then you're out to Lincoln Street and some other presidents, right? So it's very much a grid pattern. And, growing up there, you don't necessarily think about that and correlate it with planning. But we had a river that runs through the middle of town that's big enough for freighters. And so it had been some industrial blight over the years. One time it was a very industrial area, as rivers were. And Michigan, of course, was a very heavy manufacturing state. And I watched the redevelopment happen. I mean, it did take a long time, but I saw the improvements along the riverfront on different sides of the river. There was part of downtown where the downtown went to the river's edge, and there was nice parks that they had created there along the river. But in some other spots, it was not so nice. But eventually, those developed into townhomes and condominium places, and the riverfront became accessible. And
Mhm.
so, as a person in junior high, high school, I watched this happen. I thought, well, that's pretty amazing. That's some cool community building, right? You've taken these areas and really turned them into something.
Right.
And it sort of dovetails a little bit, the town dovetails with my second passion in some degree, which is architecture, is that the main street through the center of town, if you will. I mean, the river divides the town into east and west, but the center on road on the one side of town, is where all the big homes were built. The people who made the town and really had the manufacturing businesses and lumber businesses in the early years of the town. And then
Right.
you go to Second Street over, and you sort of get what would probably be second tier management, right? You get the owners, and then you kind of get the second tier management. And if you go out the streets, you can see the homes get a little bit smaller. So you almost see like that effect of class going outward a little bit and the architecture changing and the style and the size of those. But nonetheless, even though they've been smaller, they retain some style. So as I weave those two things together, enjoyment of architecture, and then realized, the grid pattern's kind of neat. And
Yeah.
then there was still some what would have been corner stores. They sort of became corner bars in my hometown. And there's a couple little areas that there's a downtown, and maybe 10, 11 blocks away was a little small 2-block shopping district, right? And what I now know, weaving in, new urbanism, if you will, Congress of New Urbanism, is, that probably facilitated the 15-minute walk shed to get to that little neighborhood shopping place if you weren't going downtown. And of course, corner stores always facilitate what we know they do, right? And of course, these were the traditional corner stores. They looked like a home, except the whole first floor interior was a little store, right? So you can see the evolution there of how I enjoyed, developed into planning. But go ahead.
No, I mean, it seems like, you kind of saw, well, the way I would put it is you observed the change that your town or city was going through. And
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't just observe it as, oh, my town's changing. It's more like this is how it's actually changing. So it's just getting to that next layer of understanding how the change is happening and how that's having an impact. Um, if I remember correctly, Seth, you had some background in construction, right? Or
Well,
did I?
correct. And I'm glad you brought that up, because in some ways that's a missing key element. Is I grew
Uh-huh.
up in a construction family, so building and tinkering with things and those sort of stuff. Then you see community building, right? On the architectural level, you're at the lot. You're really at the lot level. In
Mhm.
community building and planning, you're really at the full scale level of the size of the town or the geographical area you're working within. And so I saw how, an underutilized area could really become a benefit to the community. And because of that background and interest in merging them all together, I studied it at a greater depth than driving by and saying, oh, that's a nice building, or, oh, that's something, right? And
Right.
with my degree of interest in architecture, and I kind of hit that because it really starts from there. As the more I, analyze it, that interest there almost then segued me into planning. Is that I realized that, these buildings sort of create an interface with the human scale. Long before I knew what the human scale was, long before I knew about, you know, I understood the details of building from an architectural understanding, but not at the community level of how, when you walk down a building or along a sidewalk, that if the building doesn't have windows, it doesn't feel very inviting. Once you put the windows in there and you can see in and they can see you, right? It's that eyes on the street. Then you begin to appreciate, when I got to planning school, how all those things came together. So in the infancy, if you will, I
Mhm.
understood what I liked. I was trying to grasp that, oh, that's a nice building, but planning helped me put in context what that means as community. So,
Right.
and then like I said, from a construction background, that sort of started me on there. And you're right, to really hit that point of, it wasn't just as a casual observer, it was trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of community.
Yep. And but I imagine, just like my experience going to planning school, is you kind of realize that architecture is just a part of it, though, right? Um,
Yes, correct. You realize that, this is the interface between the two, in some ways, that planning is really building the layout, and architecture is the buildings on top of that grid work, and how does that interface with it as well, right? I mean, I think we've jumped into this discussion quickly, and we'll kind of meander through things. But this is really kind of I thought about this a little bit. Is you can have the best laid out community, but if you have buildings that don't interface with the street well, as we just talked about, it doesn't matter how good that is, how good the pattern is, the grid or whatever it is. If you do curvilinear right, and the connectivity, that doesn't work well. But if you have the best architecture and the wrong layout, that doesn't work as well either. I mean, it's better to have maybe good architecture and bad sort of layout. It's the retrofit element, right? And I think that's the layer is once you've built out a community in terms of a fabric as a network, like the grid pattern, even if it's not grid, you're pretty well stuck with that because that becomes the public right of ways. That becomes sort of the areas you develop. And so when you get into these cul-de-sac-like environments, which is the other extreme of planning, you don't on cul-de-sac something. There's a house at the end. It's difficult, hard to connect to the next community, right? And so that becomes a challenge with poorly laid out community because you're built with it. But on the flip side, once you build a building, more often than not, that's a 80, 100-year long-term piece of infrastructure too. So, you almost need to get both right because if we've talked about this, and I'm clearly much more of a student of classical architecture, but, when I look at these buildings from the 60s and 70s, to me, they don't seem to inspire this placemaking typically, right? They're very slender on the architectural details. I'm trying, they're minimalist, right?
Kind of approach to
The
design.
the minimalist approach, right? And so, to me, that's a little bit more of a challenge. But not everything needs to be classical architecture. And I've had this discussion as well. I think of the classic thing where, and maybe this puts the cap on it, is we did do some poor government buildings that didn't help with the downtown interface of that. It's mainly one massive brick wall. So we did the brick, we thought we were doing good, but then the windows are, really small, right? It almost looks like gun ports in an old castle. That's not really the image you want to go for, right? You want to have a little bit more glazing or window, right? So there's that perception that the public realm and the private realm interface. And I mean, I've definitely gone kind of down a rabbit hole here, but that's why I think there's this tension in planning a little bit, right? Between we can build the greatest fabric, but if a developer comes along with the poorest homes, what do we do with that? And how do we build community from that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll touch base on something that you talked about, that modernistic architecture. I mean, I think what happened in the 60s when you had, architects like,
By the way, I didn't mean to intend to do this, but I grabbed this cup earlier.
Well,
Charlestown now.
Somebody that we know will be very happy about it. but yeah, no. What I was gonna say is that back the 60s, that modernism in architecture, it was a very conscious effort to kind of move from that classical kind of design. And while it was fascinating and definitely some great architecture did come from it, one of the biggest challenges with it is I feel like it just is really for a niche audience. At the end of the day, it becomes a niche audience, and which in this case would be architects, basically.
Right.
You're really doing it for the architects. The Corbusier at one point tried to do a re-layout of Paris, I think. I might be wrong, but I think that's what he tried to do. And it's like, you have this much density and this many people, and per unit would be this square feet, and he just made these towers and everything. And that just did not fly, because Paris is not about fitting the density. It's the streets. It's those weird places that you go to and you experience that. So, and that has a lot of value in terms of what you call that fabric of a town or a city. And I think that's where modern architecture kind of sometimes miss the point, if I'm honest with you. But then again, there are some projects which from the outset look like they were not well thought out, but when you dig deeper into them, you kind of see how in depth an architect thinks. But yeah, the other thing I want to kind of touch base on is, like we mentioned, you come from a construction background, your family's into construction, and you're working there, you have an experience that you're gaining knowledge there, and suddenly you tell your parents that, you know what, I'm not going to be in this field anymore, I'm going to shift to urban planning. How did that go?
Well, the construction trades background was what my father was into, and some of my brothers have picked up.
Mhm.
There wasn't an expectation that I stay in that. In fact, there's an expectation that I go to college and not labor as hard and work as hard. You know, that was definitely what my mother wanted. My father said, "Don't ever work as hard as I do, in
Mhm.
terms of labor and those sort of things."
Right.
So, excuse me a moment. So that's how that came about. But it was really in my master's level that from there that I really began to. My undergrad was in something a little bit different, but it was my master's in public administration, and then I accompanied that with urban planning because that was my interest in areas we've kind of discussed already.
Mhm.
And from there, then I eventually got my first planning job, and that was in Tennessee, outside Nashville, by about 30 minutes. At that time, Lebanon, Tennessee was about 25, 26,000 residents and growing, because the Middle Tennessee, Greater Nashville area has grown significantly. And that was the first time, clearly I had my professional job. And one of the things that I really enjoyed, that you don't necessarily per se learn outright in planning school, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit, is that I really liked code writing. And what I found with code is that you really build community through code, right? I mean, it sounds pretty. If you're in practice, you're like, of course it does. That's how you get it. You have to implement it. But I
Mhm.
liked the idea of changing code to create the community you want to build. And it's, you're really taking really more or less one-dimensional words on a surface of paper and building a 3D community, which is a very unique sort of interface of how do you write something to ensure that it comes out the way you hope it does out in the real world. And
Mhm.
I remember some of my accomplishments that I'm really proud of was, increasing the number of street trees, sidewalks were not required in a commercial area. And I remember, requiring sidewalks when somebody did a certain amount of improvements and they said, look, there's no sidewalk on either side. This doesn't make sense. We're like, you've got to begin somewhere. And, I go back 6, 7 years later, and those commercial areas have good connectivity. The sidewalk is really building out. And it's one of those things I think is, I believe for most practitioners in the planning and zoning, realm in urban planning, is you get to see the things you do built out upon the ground. And and that's really impressive. Now, I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later. I've never worked at a big planning, agency, government agency, so I don't know what that feeling is if all you do is plan review all day, right? Or if you do other sort of zoning code compliance certificates, right? But it, as we've talked about several times, and we'll touch on, is when you work in a small local government, you get your hands on a lot of things, and you can really create community.
Right.
And that's a beautiful thing, although it comes with a lot of responsibility because you have other hats
Yep.
you have to wear at the same time. So, that was the Tennessee experience. That was Lebanon, Tennessee experience. And it was a great time there. I really learned a lot. Had a pretty decent mentor there, and learned some things. But you had sort of talked about, some of the stressors or planning school, that I just mentioned. Yeah, people say, why do you go into this field, right? And they always say that when you've just had a tough, cantankerous argument with somebody over signs or
Mhm.
some other violation, right?
Mhm.
And as we all know in the field, I presume this is the prevailing feeling, is that you went into planning school because thought you were going to work on great projects and build like great communities. The things that I saw on my riverfront in my hometown, right? That's what I thought I would work on, those sort of projects.
Mhm.
But what you find in practice is that it really, unfortunately, the minutiae sometimes is where community is made. We've talked about this in the past, which is that, when one person doesn't keep up with something or make an improvement to their property, it has an impact on adjacent owners, right? So when we talk about amending the sign code, as mundane as that is, we're talking about what type of image do we want our community to have? Are we okay with 50-foot tall signs that flash, or are we more a little bit subdued and want to have them no more than 25 feet tall of a certain square footage, right? We're creating community at that basic level. And so while that sign violation may not seem like much, you don't want to become the place that looks like, Las Vegas. And of course, signs are easy, classic example, but we can go down to all sorts of changes. Before I left Charlestown, if you put parking in the front of the building between the street, you have to have some shrubs, right? At least the shrubs begin to block the harshness of the vehicles, right? Now, again, that's a very small component. When you extrapolate that upon a community, and we know most of our parking is in the front of the building, at least I've been able to soften up the hardscape, of the vehicles and the road between where the pedestrian is going to walk along the sidewalk next to that, right? So that becomes where code to me is really exciting, because you really are able to build that community as I've built, discussed. And in that way, you begin to almost facilitate on a different level why you went to planning school, right? You want to leave a good place and be part of a good project. And what you find is a good project and a good development, if you will, is parcel by parcel. You're not going to get to work on a 10-acre development and build it with some sort of great public influence, because a lot of those decisions at the big scale are made by a private developer who's meeting your code, and it's the minimum checklist, right? The minimum standards. You have to change those minimum standards, as we just talked about. So it's a way of the dream at planning school and figuring out how to make that happen in the real world with the political pressures, the economic pressures, the reality that your government only has so much role and influence. I mean, they have a lot because they have the power of the government, but there's a reality of what can be built in that realm that you may exist in.
I mean, there's a checks and balance process to it, right? You just can't impose an idea. You have to go through public hearings and quite a lot of stakeholder meetings and whatnot. And again, in local government and in small cities, it's more personal. So you sometimes have to go more hoops in a way to kind of make certain changes, which can honestly turn out to be frustrating, because at the back of your head you're trying to do something that would have a positive impact, but kind of convincing people that it's going to have a positive impact is tough. But and the other thing that I just kind of want to touch base, and we've talked about it on a personally about it, but one thing that I kind of felt or realized when it comes to the local government sector is big picture ideas don't always fly. As much as you want a town to grow, with a positive quality of life, and equation that might play into it is the idea of sustainability, right? But kind of convincing a population that sustainability is the way to go, and you have to stop using your car, and these other ideas that are being imposed on you are not going to fly well. And one of the things that I noticed when speaking of code writing is you've kind of tried to incorporate that without the bigger banner of this is under sustainability, but you've just kind of incorporated that into the sidewalks and stormwater management and like these other things. You need a biosphere whenever you have something like this. And I think that was a very good learning curve for me. It was like, okay, you can still do what you want, or what you think is the right idea, but you don't always have to kind of badger somebody on the head with it. There are other ways of incorporating it, and in parcel, so to speak, parcel scales, parcel it out in a way.
Yep.
But so, and it kind of goes back, so in a way it goes to this conversation that I kind of wanted to have with you is, you've been you work for the city of Charlestown for I think 4 years, right?
5 years.
5 years. And
Yep.
prior to that, you worked at the county level
Correct.
for 8 years, I think.
Yeah, for 5 years at Jefferson County, which is
5 years at Jefferson County as well. Okay, gotcha.
yeah. So for the viewers here, Jefferson County, Charlestown is the seat of Jefferson County. So when I went to work from the county to the city of Charlestown, I literally just moved across the street and down about 3 buildings.
Yeah.
So
The
it
fun
was
was
on the same county, and I think you're going somewhere with this, but I definitely want to not miss this. Is county planning is a different level, right?
uh-huh.
And particularly, if you were in a county planning environment where it's relatively urbanized, uh, it, that might be a little bit different. It may feel more like city urban planning, but when you're doing county planning in an environment where there's a lot of agricultural land, there's suburban areas, and then parts of the county interface on urban thoroughfares, you really get a different sort of transect, if you will. You do go from the agricultural to the urban. And, you talk about getting concepts approved in planning and trying to figure those out is that, clearly the agricultural has to develop either a slower rate or not at all, which is a whole other policy decision.
Mhm.
There's always this hope that I'm going to be able to develop my property that's farmland, but you're on a twisty, turny country road that isn't even striped, that has no shoulders. There's no water and sewer, right? You can do maybe septics on some of them, but your zoning may not permit it. And so there's this hope that even though I'm far away from any urban level amenities, that I can develop. And the politicians have a tough time saying, you know, no, we don't want to change your zoning preemptively too early, right? So that you can put a lot of houses on septic instead of water and sewer. And that's not to advocate one or the other. The point here is planning properly, right? If we can drive some density in the urban areas, we can slow the loss of farmland. And we could get into the discussion after what I'm about to say of price and value and affordability. But the reality is if you make the farmland valuable in a different sense,
Mhm.
that it's less developable, that it is just going to be farmland, that value goes up in its own right. I mean, all the farmers think their only way they can cash out is through land development. Now, that is one way to do it. I believe the county has to be proactive in allowing alternative farm uses, right? The U pickums, the pumpkin patches, the
Mhm.
vineyards, right? So they can create some value on that. But if you keep urban level amenities there, and I'm going to really hit on government functions, is that the local government, even the county government, has to pay for all this infrastructure, right? The roads eventually need to be repaved, the water lines need to be redone, even if the developer puts them in. So when you talk about sprawl, essentially, is kind of what I'm getting at is, you know, at the county level, I felt like I was on a defensive to figure out a way, in some ways, to reduce the quickness of which agricultural areas that shouldn't develop were developing, because you're so far from anything. I mean, it creates a different level of requirements. The citizens on that country twisty turny road, if they're on septic and maybe not in water, they now want a better road, right? Because they live there. Then they place pressure upon the state, and so there's a place for everything and a value for that. And so at the county level, it was a big struggle, at least for me, because you're always playing defensive on one hand of trying not to have farms develop. On the other hand, saying shift it over here where there's adequate water, sewer, and everything else. And the challenge to me is that in the communities I've worked in Lebanon and in Charlestown, come grow with us. That's easy. We intend to develop. There is no quote inappropriate area, right? You might not be contiguous to the next development, but is in a master plan, it's intended to be all built out contiguously. So I didn't have to fight that battle of, we shouldn't change the zoning on this farm to something more intensive, because it should remain for a farm much longer in the future, right? And again, that can drive the value upward because there's only so much farmland and the uses that can go on there. So I've kind of gone down another rabbit hole but the point there at county planning, I felt this continual tension and fear of changing the code, because when we changed the code, we didn't move the code an inch, we moved it a mile. And so it seemed like we lost ground on trying to do ag preservation initiatives. And that was a challenge for me because, I understood the value of that agricultural area.
I mean, basically, what you're trying to say is one thing that you just felt like, looking from a county level, you really wanted to preserve as much as agricultural land you can for as long as possible, and kind of have a more what we call like a compact development, right? Like and
Right.
kind of leans towards this idea of a walkable city, right? And
Hmm.
I remember talking to you about it a little bit, but we never went deep into it. But the more I look at Charlestown, I think about it, I really am starting to kind of think we really have to kind of have this conversation about how can we make it more walkable. I mean, it's kind of still walkable, but how to really reinforce that as an idea.
The
But what
connectivity needs to be a little greater. You're right there. Add
yeah,
to that.
yeah, what I did want you to say, and I think it kind of covers the county level experience, the challenges that you faced, that kind of struggle between, you know, things that you kind of have to do and things you kind of want to do.
Hmm.
But when you came to the city level, what were the challenges that you felt, especially working for like a local government with a population of what? Now it's just 6,000. Maybe it was 5,000 when you kind of joined in, right?
Sure. When I came to Charlestown, there were some organizationally some things I had to do to take care of, and really kind of reorganize the department, put some things together. But the broader question here is the struggle of small, you know, the broader question here is planning in a small community,
Mm-hmm.
and what are the challenges there? And there's a couple of them. One of the first ones is that unlike a large town or a large city where you have lots of parks, there's a recognition that we need a parks department to maintain that. You got a large town, they know that you're going to have code violations. We have a code department for that, right? It's very clear we're large enough to have these needs, whatever it be, right? Whatever agency of government it may be. The problem at small governments, and this is a real challenge, is when do you shift to that next level and have that next need? And this really comes down to a personnel discussion. At what point is one person doing too much, wearing too many hats, and we need to pull somebody in? And the challenge therein lies if you pull somebody in too early, there's not enough work for them to do. The other flip side is by the time you pull somebody in, somebody's overworked and is tired and has pushed themselves to their limit and may leave or may rest a little while.
Basically.
Yeah, you're overburdened, right? So I think that's the struggle in terms of a small local government from a personnel standpoint, is that it's very much like shifting a vehicle. You shift too early, you could stall. You shift too late, the vehicle has jerks. Jerks.
Mhm.
So that's a struggle there, and then you're trying to convince administrative folks and political folks that there's actually a need. And it's one of those things, is like so many things in life that we go through, is like, wow, I didn't know I needed that till I had it, right? Once you have it, you go, oh, I needed that, right?
Right.
The other thing you've kind of touched on, and this is really goes both ways, is that interpersonal level in a local government, right? You build sort of relationships, you people come in, right? There's only so many movers and shakers in town, right? And you're going to bump into those, and they're going to bump into you,
Hmm.
and you're going to get to know each other. You'll have better rapport with some than others, and at the end of the day, you're always regulating them.
Hmm.
And there is sort of that thing of they want to come in and try to persuade you one way or another, or just try and understand how it applies to them. And you may have a good rapport with this person. At the end of the day, you have to regulate them, and it's a challenge sometimes. But it's small enough government where this person who's a mover and shaker probably knows one of the local politicians well, and may have meet them at the grocery store, other things, say, hey, by the
Right.
way, I think this person's going too far this way, or I don't really like this. And that sometimes is a little bit different than maybe a bigger place. Now, there's always movers and shakers that are of considerable size in any government, and they're going to always interface with the elected officials.
Right.
But that tends to be more of a different type of lobbying. All this is lobbying in some ways, but it's more sophisticated versus, something at a local level where it's maybe not quite as sophisticated. Your mover and shaker may not be as polished as a guy in New York City who's built, 10, 15, 20-story skyscrapers. That's a different level of polish, right? And of salesmanship there that they can do to the local folks. So that's one of those struggles that I found at the local level. And they may even grown up with somebody, right? That's the other thing too, right? Small local government, the person you're regulating may have gone to school with the elected official, right? So they've got a huge background. They may get together on the weekends. So that's an element. I mean, the flip side is you get to know people and they begin to understand why you do things.
Right.
And so small, the one somebody once said though, I mean, a small local government is a beautiful thing, a good thing, is that you can make a mistake in the morning and fix it by the afternoon, right? There's only so many layers of bureaucracy, right?
Right.
Now, I've went to an interview one time at Loudoun County, and I just looked across aisle after aisle of cubicles, and I thought, oh my, this is a whole different environment, right? And one of the things and we both know is somebody comes to the front window, we're only one staff member deep, right? There's only one of us. I'd like to talk to so-and-so who sent me this letter, or I'd like to talk to so-and-so who's ever proposing this. They're going to get to interface with you. In a larger organization, sometimes you're going to have to set up an appointment. You're going to have to work with the receptionist. It's much more organized, whereas a local government is a lot more fluid, which is good when you want to get certain things done, but then everybody has your number. They can call directly to your office. There's no, in a big building, you go up the elevator, you go to the third floor trying to find Rashidul. You go through the first set of doors, you get to that, you see a receptionist. There's a glass wall, more doors. They're like, sorry, Rashidul doesn't take appointments. You take an appointment with his supervisor, right? That's where we definitely get the direct connection with the public.
Right. And I've actually, so when I say I have mixed feelings about it, does not necessarily mean that I'm confused about it. But what I'm trying to say is that there are moments where you do appreciate that kind of having that accessibility with the public, or rather the public having that accessibility with you. But sometimes it kind of borders between, now you're asking me to do favors for you. And I'm like, I just don't want to have that. I mean, I want to help you, but I don't want to do favors for you. And this is a conversation that I've had with you, and we've kind of had like a sort of a disagreement on it. It's like, there are certain people who contribute to this community and therefore maybe have a little bit more say than some other people. And I've always been like, no, everyone should be equally treated, blah, blah, blah. And again, I know there's a kind of like a difference in point of view, but I want to clarify, I never felt that, what you were doing was wrong or anything like that. It's just kind of like, I think for me, what I've found that it becomes really difficult to navigate, because then you're kind of beholden to kind of, oh, me on a personal level, right? So you just kind of find yourself kind of struggling with, am I making a biased decision? But then you need those relationships as well, as we know that, because these are people who have a sense of the pulse of the town. They know the town maybe on a much deeper level that you and I ever did. I mean, obviously you've been here for a long time, but still, like you said, they grew up here, so they know the town on a deeper level. Therefore, you don't want to cross that connection off either, and it's a really tough balancing act. And what I've found that the best way I can kind of feel good about myself is having a system in place. What I said, there's enough room for you to kind of work with us, but then there should be a point where we stop.
And this pulls together a few different elements. Is that, as and we've discussed several times before offline, is that it was important for me to feel that everybody was treated fairly, right? That they were all treated the same in some fashion, and that, if I was just discuss things with you, I'd be honest with you, and I'd be open with you. You may not like what I say, I can't change the rules, I can't change the regulations, but I'm going to be fair with you as I am the next person on the same exact issue. And, philosophically, there is that element that, we are paid by the citizens. We are, servants to the citizens, right? So that accessibility kind of plays into that. And to your point about, do we work more with somebody else than another person? It does become, going back to why do we go to planning school? To see good projects come out of the ground, right? the people who are the movers and shakers, those are the ones who probably are in our office the most, asking things, trying to understand things. Is they're also going to be the ones who build our community, right? So there's an element here at which, we want to keep a relationship open with them, not any more or less than somebody else. But there's that sense that it perceives like we're giving more attention to that person. And maybe on the surface, we might be giving them more attention, but not more fairness, right? I remember a project where I had you sketch up some townhomes, 7 different ways. Some of them didn't fit well at all. And were we putting some sardines in a can? Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But we could have improved a neighborhood significantly if that person had taken, the initiative of the plans and done something with those, right? And so in that way, yes, I did spend more time with them. I did try and consider those because we could have done one of those things why we went to planning school is to build something out. And that is one of those things of, there's only so many people with deep pockets in your community, right? And some of them are going to leave nothing behind that's good. Let's face it. And there's some people who understand it's their community and want to do at least something good. It's a very small niche of people who leave a great, phenomenal product and community, right? The few people have that much interest and desire to do so. But that does come down to, why do you court somebody more, right? Because they're going to be the ones who build things. And they're also the first ones to run to the politicians and say, Seth is being difficult on me and tough, right? I mean, I'm not going to change the rules. I've had people go to them and I've defend, we've got a code. If you want to change the code, that's what you have to do. There's nothing in the code that says he's a nice guy or she's a nice guy, right?
And I think that's, it's funny. Like just yesterday, there was this particular project that I was working on and it was sign related and it's difficult, right? You want to uphold what's written in the code, right? Because it went through a process, people did not have any issues with it, therefore it's incorporated into the ordinance. But then, and that was the struggle that I was going through. I'm like, okay, basically I have to tell no to this person, but I don't just want to say no, I want to give them a few options. But as we try to explore options, I'm like, man, I'm really bending the rules. Am I? Like, you really feel like, okay, you're really trying to bend rules. And I was asking my colleague that, where does it stop? Like, when do we stop bending the rules to the point where it feels like, it's kind of losing the essence of the code? Finally, we were kind of able to come to a solution where we felt like, you know what, we're probably not bending too much rules. Or when I say bending rules, so that people know, really talking about variances and waivers, right? And there was a solution that we did eventually come up with. And it's a struggle because you want people to enjoy, developing here, working here, but you also want to make sure that approach or whatever they're trying to do does not have a negative impact on the community as a whole.
Well,
and it's not always easy to understand which one will and which one won't.
And maybe to put this to a poignant point, if you will, I guess, is, if we could pipe Trey in a moment. When for our viewers, Trey was our front window person, and she was phenomenal and did a great job down there. But we would have to, in our downtown, is just basically 3 blocks long and, a block and a half deep, essentially. So there's only so many places and there's only so many restaurants. We would have to get them either on signs or other violations they might have, or maybe their personal residence because they live in town. And I remember her ticking off this list of, well, can't eat at that restaurant, can't eat at that restaurant, can't it? And so that brings that small down home feeling to a close when you're like, oh, you know what? I'd like to go to the restaurant. I want to shop local, but I've also had to regulate them and send them a violation. Like, are they going to like me? Are they not? But what you find, and it comes back to fairness, and I won't go on too long with this, is that as long as people believe they're being treated fairly, they'll accept a lot. And that was one of the things that my reputation has always been. I am firm but fair. You've got a flashing sign, you point to the guy across the street or gal across the street, I'm going to get their flashing sign. If they have too big of a sign and you point out somebody else's, or I say, I'm already working on theirs, they always appreciated that we were consistent in at least what we did from one person to the next. They might not like it, but at least they knew they weren't singled out. And therein lies really the issue with anything. Does this rule apply to everybody? Yes, it does. I'm not going to pick and choose who it does and doesn't apply. And that goes back to you, right? What point does the essence get lost? I mean, unfortunately, you're right, is that all places have to deal with this. And at what point do you kind of bend that rule to which it breaks? And coming back to small governments, which I guess we're kind of spending some time on, which is a good thing, is that it's very visible, right? Who made that decision? There's only one person making that decision. Why did Rashidul allow them to get away with that, right? Why can't I have that? Mm-hmm. And so you get into that precarious situations, like people know you, they see you on the street, you go to their shop, right? There's no anonymity. And really, when I left the county, let's talk about farmers market a moment and local government. When I left the county and then went to the city, there's a point I stopped going to the farmers market. When I went to the farmers market, I'd hear about county issues. Can you believe they're doing A, B, C, and D? I'd go to the farmers market and hear about then the town side, right? If I wasn't getting hit by the county issues, I was getting hit by the town issue. I'm like, this is a Saturday morning. Like, I'm supposed to be off the clock, but you're never really off the clock, right?
No.
I mean, I think that's the difference. If I'm working in Loudoun County, nobody knows who Seth is up on that third floor, second row in the cubicle. He's just another bureaucrat.
Right. But, it's interesting. I still feel like kind of touching about it. How do you feel about that? That element of like, sometimes you're making friends because it's like, I've told you this, they're your friend till the day, you say no. Right. And it happens back and forth. Like one day they're mad at you, the next day they're happy with you, which is fine. I mean, but what I'm trying to ask is, how do you actually feel that? Like, how does that have an impact on you as a professional and maybe up to a certain extent on a personal level?
Sure. So I think, maybe the viewers are beginning to pick up a little bit from both of us, is that it does add a little bit of a stress, right? It's not that there's any place that's not stressful. I mean, there's big projects that come through big communities. Mm-hmm. Those planners, the screws are put to them to make sure this happens because this is a huge project. It's right. $100 million development. I don't want to take away from that. But I think all of us in the field, in some ways, I guess, really to answer that question, depending on the level of project you're involved with, it does affect you. Person X, all of a sudden, you feel like you're in this adversarial relationship, which you don't want to be with. And I guess we've spent a lot of time almost feeling like these all end up in adversarial, which they don't. But it does weigh on you a little bit when it's easy when it's black and white. You can't build a nuclear reactivity center here.
Yeah.
A scrolling sign versus a blinking sign, right? Blinking sign isn't permitted, is scrolling permitted, right? Then you kind of get into that gray area, right? And there's a local shop that does great food, you get into this real tension and you're like, man, you go home and like, I think I've had to burn some cred with people I like, or, you get this sense of like, I really don't want to make this decision because I know these people, but I have to make this decision. And so it wears on you mentally, emotionally, and you carry that because, it goes back to what we keep saying. You're going to see these people again, over and over again. And, there's another element to this where at me and my level, I got to know my city council members at Charlestown well. And I'd have to stand up there sometime and they disagree with me. And that's their right. They're the policy makers and all those sort of things. But, sometimes they look at it and you go, why did you ever bring this up? And it goes back to what you said is sometimes people don't get that global perspective per se. And I know that sounds a little bit intellectual and haughty, but, we had a purpose, right? And so now you feel like, man, they think we're crazy. And so it does begin to weigh on you, like these decisions after decisions. And some days it just seems like there's no good decision that can be made. They are all gray. And you have to make those and think about those. And you can tell by kind of my stammering here, just what do you do? How do you find a path forward? But sometimes you just have to make that hard decision and move forward and know that this is
just gotta live with it.
What's that?
And just live with that decision, right? Like whether if it goes bad, it just goes. And I think that's one thing that I'm trying to kind of come into terms with, right? You don't want to make a wrong decision. God knows, in our department, when you were there, even now, if it's a basic, simple sign, if something's wrong with that sign, you know, I've had so many conversations with my colleagues on like, what can we do? Or why are we saying no? And it almost goes to the point where you're skipping lunch, you're just kind of spending hours on it, and you're just kind of getting frustrated with it.
Mhm.
But the reason behind it is you just don't want to make a wrong call. More so than that is you want to make sure that your decision does come from a fair place, right?
Correct.
But this is what I'm trying to come into terms with is maybe even with the most best of intentions, you probably still will make a wrong call. Like, and
Correct. And you're bound to.
yeah, it's just you can't really avoid that. I mean, you hope that you won't, but as we all know, you can't make everybody happy, no matter how good your intentions might be. There's
Well,
always
and
a guy who's never
that
happy, you know.
well, and one of the things we're missing in this discussion that's easy to forget when you kind of get into this minutia a little bit is that you know when you make a decision, particularly if it's a gray area, right? There's
Uh-huh.
ones that are black and white, not a problem.
Right.
And those are easy. But when you make that decision, you've set a precedent. Nowhere in the rest of the city in that same zoning category, under that same criteria, can it ever happen again, right? So what seems benign in place A, and you know it's benign, we all know it's benign, it's not going to be hurtful. But when you take it to the next
Yep.
zoning property
Yep.
in a different sort of setting, you're like,
You're
that's
like,
pretty
how
impactful.
come how come you let that happen, right?
That's correct. I
Yeah.
mean, and I wish I had a great example, but that's sort of that thing. And maybe the great example is somebody says, look, what's behind me is a trash dump. I
Mhm.
want a 10-foot tall fence on my property. Well, I'm sorry, 6 fences all you get, but it's a trash yard. You're 100% right. You probably should have a 10-foot fence. But if you apply that to everywhere else, it makes no sense. It's just that one place. And I'm sorry, I can't. As much as it makes sense because you're building a beautiful brand new building
Mhm.
that's behind you, you're going
Mhm.
to have to get a variance to get the height.
Mhm.
And in the like, this is ludicrous.
Mhm.
Beautiful brand new building, dump.
Mhm.
But if you do it as somewhere else, I mean, you don't want to turn the town into like a mini fortress, with everybody in their own lot. So that would be the example in which your precedent setting when
Yeah,
you
and,
make
yeah,
decisions.
and I want to kind of, well, not wrap it up, but I really want to kind of add this. One thing that I learned in this town, especially going to the zoning codes, is, and it kind of is reflected in our conversation, is that one would imagine that all you have to do is look into the code book and ordinance and kind of see what it says, and there you go. Bob's your uncle. That's the decision. But unfortunately, code compliance or like zoning ordinance in general, while it does follow a very objective route, interpretation of it can be subjective.
Mhm.
Therefore, let's just say as an example, whatever decision that you made on a certain particular issue, while that applied when you were there, now when I'm looking into it and I don't have your feedback, I'm like, okay, I'm making a different interpretation. And I kind of have to run with it because that's
Mhm.
my interpretation of it. And I think then people get the impression that that's, either you guys are confused or you guys don't know what you're doing,
Mhm.
right? But the reality is just how you're interpreting the text.
That's correct.
It varies. So therefore, whenever there's a change in personnel, sometimes those things also happen. Is it a good thing, bad thing? I don't know. But all I know that it is very subjective, and it's a struggle. It's really a struggle to kind of maintain that consistency of what happened in the past, and kind of continuing that. But the reality is things change,
And
and
again, I don't know how many of your viewers are planners versus just people of interest. Is that a lot of our decisions are black and white. You have to put in, a 20-foot wide road. You have these standards, but we're I guess we're focusing on areas where it causes you that, decision making process.
right.
And I don't want to leave people to think that all of it is subjective, but there's these points where you do have to interface, and that, hey, like it's challenge of any job, right? Uh, those areas where there's a little bit of gray you have to solve. But in our area, you know, I was gonna say in our area, I think the challenge is, and that preface almost made it sound like there's something exceptional about us, but you know, we're dealing with the public and decision making and consistency in creating community. What are we going back to all the time, right? As planners, you know, what type of community does the town envision, right?
Mhm.
And we've used signs a lot as an example, but you know, if you want to try and pull buildings closer to the road, how do you do that? What fashion can you do that, right? And you may change the code, and that applies for some people and not others. And I guess the broader point here is that some of these things go back to why we're in planning, right? To try and build communities, be consistent, have good things, right? It's these interfaces that we're talking about where sometimes you feel like you're losing grasp of that goodness, right? Or those, you know, are we building the community we want? But yeah.
No, and I think that's a good way to kind of piggyback on in terms of a question, which is, you know, I know we've kind of focused more on code.
Mm.
You know, if you're interested in it, you're definitely going to enjoy it. But one thing that I really want to say is that that's not all we did. You know, we
Yeah.
were trying to build a community, and um, you know, in planning school, you come up with these great ideas, and there are great ideas. There are noble ideas. There are valuable ideas to implement as part of a planner in his profession. But when you kind of come to the real world, or at least you know the way we've worked or the experience that we've had, it's not always easy to kind of make those things a reality. Let's just say, you know, all around the world, people understand that, you know, bicycling is a good, you know, mode of transportation. It kind of has a positive impact on society, community, so on and so forth. But kind of having that kind of an idea or public transportation, that's a good idea. But implementing these ideas into a town like Charlestown is one, it's a long game. And sometimes so far into the future that you're almost like, yeah, we're not even going to think about it. Now, I'm
Mhm.
not saying Charlestown doesn't think about it, but I'm just saying that sometimes we're struggling to get sidewalks in, right? Like in certain places.
Well,
And therefore, my question is, you know, as you try to kind of improve or kind of try to build a better community, what were those challenges that either were a source of frustration for you, or is just things that you felt like I can't crack this, you know, I just can't make that change happen?
well, it's a very good question, and particularly right is how do you get towards your end goal, right? You know, in a small community, the higher level planning mechanisms are not going to be there, right? Like we talked about the word sustainability, mass transit, right? Or those sort of elements.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have a lot of bicyclists, right? You're not putting in those share rows, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was trying to think about the things. I was going to go into something about all the things we did do, but some of those nuts to crack is, um, you know, I felt I did was a little bit blessed in some ways that Charlestown have an open palette a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
of what we could get done. I'm trying to think of examples where it was a little bit of a challenge, but I think it always comes back to convincing people in of why planning exists and what we do and the decisions we make. And I think where I'd like to get with this a little bit is maybe less than what we couldn't crack, but what we could do or frustrations. And I can give a couple examples. There is, I expect, you know, when we put the first historic overlay district or expanded the historic overlay district,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that was quite a process. So Charlestown had only done with the historic district either dealt with demolitions, new construction, or signs. You could take out old historic doors and windows and put in new ones. So they had no protection. So I wrote the design review standards. I was able to get that implemented without too much struggle. But then the discussion was, let's basically double the historic overlay district. That's the area where the Historic Landmarks Commission can review more structures and their facades, right? And protect the fabric of the character of the community and the historic buildings, right? I mean, there's a school of thought you lock buildings into this historic time capsule and nothing can happen. And it's not quite that rigid. Um, but you come to Charlestown because of its historic character, right? That is its identity. So we needed to protect that. from a governmental regulation standpoint, which, there's a scale to that. If it's that important, then you should help me pay for some of these things. And, the government has interfered. And so that was that tension. And so to double and expand the historic overlay district took me about 18 months and again, getting something approval of 18 months in local government is an eternity. Maybe in other governments, that's standard practice, but, 6 months is a long time. So, I mean, I basically get batted between, the city council, planning commission, historic landmarks commission, go back around, take things out, put things in, should we redo this? And then we had a public hearing on this expansion, and it became a town hall format, which really worked out well. I was able to field questions. There was some tension in there between different members and factions, but we got that passed. And so we were able to build community on this level that we essentially, on the surface, we didn't change a thing, really, when you think about it, in terms of what exists, but we built community because we protected what is there into the future. It's an ironic way. I've never thought about that way. We really made no change, but made a change by saving what was there for the future. Sure. But the nut there that was tough to crack is we're only reviewing the facade, the front of the building, or a corner if there's a street. That's only 1/4 of the house that has historic character, right? What happens if you build an addition to the back and side, right? That's historically inappropriate and not, let's say, just block, I mean, the side facing, I guess, gets reviewed, but not the new side, right? As long as it faces the neighbor's house. That was something I don't think, I could crack because now it's not visible from the public road right away. It was something long-term I wanted to push the envelope on, but incrementalism, right? Actually, it's a key thing I want to point out here, and maybe that talks about success and challenges and overcoming things, is you've heard me talk about this all the time. I'm a big believer in incrementalism. You're not going to get to your end goal. You're not going to get, perfect sidewalks and connectivity day one. How do you implement something that slowly gets there, right? We implemented a sidewalk improvement grant program. It didn't necessarily take off the way we had hoped in Charlestown, but property owner could match that, right? You improve the sidewalks. The better the sidewalks are, a little bit more people will walk on those. I think the town has to, from a higher policy level, push that envelope. And the political challenge, I guess what we're talking about, some things here, is that, you take your skate park project a little bit, right? It's trying to get that ball rolling, and at what scale do you do it, and how do you move that forward, and can you get buy-in, and also limited dollars to that. So let me wax on this a little bit. But during our time there and working together, I mean, we really did build good community. I mean, it was a historic overlay district. We added future things that Blaze Pizza now has to abide by. Improvements in landscaping. I've widened the sidewalk from 4 feet to 5 feet. Now, only to us in planning and the real geeks understand that that's a greater walking width. I reduced the pavement width in new subdivisions. The politicians don't even understand that 20 years from now, I saved them a lot of money on road repavings because there's going to be a narrower way. I've slowed traffic down in these developments, right? The downtown aspects come a long way because the town hired a coordinator and, events. And the thing there was the businesses now had a champion within town to promote their things, right? They felt, if we're so important, where's the town investing in us? And I think that was a great way to extend the community building. When you came on, we were able to do design projects that, just wasn't available with the staff level that we talked about in local government, to show like, this is what community can look like. You can start doing those planning. And see, that is the challenge of planning. It becomes esoteric, and we in the field have to really almost be taught salesmanship. How do you sell the idea like, we're really building community? That sounds great, but what's that look like? Because all those people pick up is a book this thick, full of words, no images typically. But we really are building community. And you were able to do some design work to show in those changes we were making of facades and buildings, this is what we can do. I guess one of the challenges that always exist is residential subdivisions always want to stay in pods and not connect to other neighborhoods.
Hmm.
And that's a big battle I've always fought, because we're building a town, not subsection A, B, C, and D. This is Charlestown, not subdivision Happy Acres, subdivision Bright and Sunny. And you balkanize your community, right? That's not what you want to do. You want to feel that people are part of the community. And in some ways, that's where sidewalk and connectivity, as people cross one another, right? You break down that barriers of, like, they live in the 3,000 square foot houses and I live in the 2,000. And I've kind of gone on a little bit, but we did build good community. There's a lot of good community built in Charlestown. You and I working on the sidewalk project when I left. I mean, we were taking input from property owners, about downtown improvements. I Here's one to share with your viewers. I mean, it was near and dear to your heart. The food trucks, right?
Yeah.
The food trucks. I mean, that I respect the physical bricks and mortar property owners who came out and said, look, Charlestown's a tough market, small community. Again, you've only got so many people. You don't have high rises coming around to your place and office buildings.
They rely on the peak, lunch hour to kind of make their money.
They're living on peaks, lunch, some dinner, and the weekends. And they've got to float the other times, with those peaks. And so the competition taking out one of their peaks, lunch, food trucks, which can come and go to any community, was one of those things we weren't able to achieve. And at first, I was like, this is kind of a bummer. But in the long term, I'm like, you know what? We heard from the business owners. We heard from the community. They're absolutely right. We need to stay stronger internally before we allow this. And it is our bricks and mortar buildings that are there working with the downtown coordinator, giving out gift cards and, doing things for the community, supporting each other, right? I think of a couple businesses where, hey, I've got my meats from, the barbecue place and we're making this great sandwich, and it starts cross-pollinating. Are you going to get that with the food truck? Like, hey, I picked up the hot dog, off the food truck and, I made chili mac. I mean, that's really not community building.
What I'll say about that one is, I think I told you that, hey, before we move for, because the normal process would be you would draft an ordinance that kind of supports that, but then you go to the public hearing process, and that's where the public kind of gives their input, and they might be happy or not, and then council or the planning commission has to kind of make a decision on it, right? I think the good thing that happened with it was I remember telling you that maybe we should do a initial outreach, like this is what we're thinking about, let's do it. And then we had that whole town hall meeting, which was kind of like the outcome of it was like, we don't want this now. Just like, I was really bummed about it because I really wanted a food truck here, but at the end of the day you feel like we actually went through that process, and actually understand what the community may or may not want. Therefore, it helped us determine whether we should move forward or not. Now, maybe now, because we're kind of like, kind of getting back and being more active, maybe this idea would float more. Something I'll tell you after this whole interview. You might find it interesting.
Well, and let's talk about this for a minute. And I know all government agencies have to deal with this, but it comes back to small government. Is we go down and eat in those restaurants and we see the owners. The people came to those meetings were the owners. And we basically said, we hear you loud and clear. We're going to stop this process because we respect you as business owners.
Right. No, absolutely.
We picked up so much street credit from the town. Listened to us. They heard us out. We didn't come to an empty meeting just because they had to check off the box and they were going to do this no matter what.
I'm glad you kind of clarified that, because that's the thing. We were not just doing, it wasn't the token public involvement process. It's like, hey, you and I personally would love to have a food truck, right? Because whatever. But before we actually move forward with it, let's talk to the businesses that will be the impacted the most. And when we kind of got that feedback, no, we really don't want this right now. We were like, all right, let's shelve this.
Then
on a personal level, we were not like, oh shit, we didn't get it. But like from a participation point of view, I feel like we did a little bit more than what's generally done.
And then we had the flip situation. Remember a time later, everybody was mad that, why can't I have more than 25% of my window covered with signs, right? 25% is the max in Charlestown. And of course, that's where people put their advertisement. My argument is that you have a maximum to put on your window because it's an interface, again, like I talked about before from community building. People see in, people see out, right? Humans are social creatures. When they look in, like, oh, that bar's hopping, I want to go in there. If
Right.
it's so covered with stuff, I said a bar, it could be a restaurant, it could be anything. It could be an arcade, right? Anything. If it's so covered that you can't see what's going on in there, you don't feel comfortable because now you open the door, right? Now you feel socially obligated to enter, right? There's all these cascade of things that happen. Whereas if you walk by and like, oh, there's a lot going on in there. Looks like a safe place. I want to go in there. If your windows are covered, that doesn't happen. Now, some people will say that's esoteric, but I'm telling you there's a psychological human nature to this, which again, I think planning school probably should have a couple courses on psychology of human nature and sales and how to make a sales, because really some things we really do have to pitch. But the point of this discussion isn't that. We had an opposite situation where everybody's outraged. I should be able to cover my windows as much as I want. It doesn't matter what the town says. And then we hold the meeting on 3 different topics, and this was one of the biggest ones, and it only happened like 2 weeks before that I sent out some warnings. Some of the biggest people who were upset didn't even come. When I explained the purpose of this, nobody really pushed back and said, we need a change. So that was a different level of involvement where no complaint, no concern meant no change on that, right? We were trying to make a change on one hand, they didn't want. On the flip side, we were saying, where's the balance here? Because we can't do 100% of your window. Is 25, is 30%? We can all argue that those numbers are somewhat arbitrary. The higher you get, the more you go back to my argument. But it became the flip of like, we gave you an opportunity, you came out. It must not be a real problem for all of you because you're not clamoring about it.
Right. Yeah. And I still have the diagram in my office, which kind of shows like almost like from an architectural point of view, or from a design point of view, like, as a human being, as you're walking down the street, what's your visual and eyesight level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you kind of put the signs so that you don't block the eyesight to look into the inside of a building. And if people say it's esoteric, it's esoteric. But the thing is, the reality is, people go to streets that are lively, that are brightly lit, and you're not walking into a dead end. And the moment you have those open windows, what you're doing is essentially not only letting light get into the street, but also kind of giving a sense of a liveliness,
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it just draws more people in.
And there's a part of this that even for the business owners themselves, that you inundate somebody with too much signage, it's overload, right? I mean, there's a functionality there too, right? And that's another school of thought. I mean, that's just a pure marketing business, private sector thing. I mean, they'll tell you too much signage is a bad thing because you've just overwhelmed your customer, right? Bite size, small, and again, we've kind of gone down to the minutia, but there's value to these things. And I'm going to pause there in a minute. Then I think this is an element in planning that maybe it's my philosophical bent, but it is the devil in the details that make community. Where did we start? We talked about architecture, right? And how that interfaces, right? And we'll go to that for one quick moment is, most architectures, most people don't know this, but they see it and understand it, right? There's a base, there's a middle, there's a cap. But when a building doesn't seem to have a conclusion, people like, that building looks kind of odd, right? That modern, there's these details that are important. Too much signage, overload purely on your customers. Too much signage, clutter for the community. Too much signage, people can't see in. Liveliness. It's a both ways. And, there's a lot of human studies in urban planning about space, right? If you have a big plaza, people won't go to the center of the plaza unless there's something there that's a feature because they feel unprotected. There's still this biological nature. Again, there's a lot of interface here where those details mean something and get back to what are we trying to create? Community, places that people feel comfortable. Communities are for people, right? And that's what we're trying to get after. And if we can make it pleasant, you have a sidewalk. Shouldn't we have some street trees, shading, comfortability, right? Street lights. These things all add up to a fabric which people go, oh, that's a nice community. It feels good. It's walkable, right? I mean, that's an element we have to consider in our planning realm.
No, absolutely. I mean, for me, yeah, from my background, I definitely agree with that, But one thing that I'm also kind of learning, at least as I'm working here, which is basically that sure, design has a key element to it. It's really the kind of like the interface, right? That
Yes.
actually makes sense. But the more time goes by, I'm really realizing kind of the power of policymaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I think that's something that a lot of architects who kind of decide to move into urban planning, because for them the perception ends up being, oh, I'm just designing a bigger canvas.
Correct.
No, it's actually you are kind of designing a bigger canvas, but not the way you kind of imagine it. It's through the policies that you kind of set things up, and I think that understanding that has been a very key element to my experience. The other thing that I want to just add, and I feel like you will agree with me on it, is for a local government, I think one of the biggest challenges is having enough resources and kind of personnel and staff to kind of get things done. I know it sounds like an excuse, right? Like, from the outset it might, but at this point I can see, because I'm just experiencing it, let's just put it this way. But one thing I would kind of want to ask is, based on your like experience so far, have you ever been able to find how to kind of resolve these issues, or are you still working on it?
I think this is a field where that tension always exists. And I'm be clear about the tension. One is the personnel that you said, right? You know, even the places that have huge planning staff, they're just taking on bigger projects, right? You
They're
know,
all
you
short.
think about Northern Virginia, other places, you know, there's new train stops, right? So now they've got to re-envision those locations as transit-oriented developments, the TODs, right? And so I'm sure they're taxed and they could use more staff to help with them. Um, and sometimes they have the resources to hire consultants, which in the local government, there's usually not that. Or, the scale of what you want to hire a consultant is too small as well, right?
Mhm.
And so there is that key tension there from a personnel standpoint. Then the other is policy, right? You know, different people come in and out of government who vote on these things, right? It is the politicians, it's the elected officials, that's the word I was looking for, elected officials, who
Mhm.
make these decisions. Do they get planning? Do they understand how this is going to benefit their community? And if you don't have that, they don't understand why 100% coverage of a window
Mhm.
creates a different feeling, right? They don't understand why certain things are the way we do. They're like, well, that seems kind of crazy. That's counterintuitive. But part of what we do sometimes is that way. Like, why should we be regulating somebody's facade? Well, because they didn't come to Charlestown to visit Walmart and CVS. I can guarantee you that. They came here to see the quaintness of Charlestown, right? And there's a personnel tension and capability, and then there's a political elected officials. Do they understand what you're doing? And often that takes higher up administrative people to even understand that, so they can make the sales pitch to the politician, like, we're building something bigger here. This isn't just about, you know making sidewalks wider to cost the developer more money. It's so that two people can feel comfortable walking along each other, right? There's and it becomes those things of, I remember, you know certain standards of, like, why does everything have to be paved? Why can't we get away with something a little less? And you're like, well, it's a commercial facility. I mean, what would you expect to have happen?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think there's always that thing of like that perception of this is how we see it going. This is that route. It's gonna sound very um, intellectual and kind of like, you know, hoity-toity basically, but kind of you just have a vision for the future, right?
Yes.
So like this is how I kind of imagine Charlestown being, and it could insert any town really,
Sure.
to be honest with you. But you're kind of playing this 50-50 gamble also, because especially in a place like Charlestown, where especially after the recession, how it had a real impact on the growth of this city. You know, like you want to say that it's going to happen to this town because you envision the potential there, you see the potential there, but other things play a factor into it, the market, people wanting to invest in Charlestown, right?
Mhm.
COVID-19, like
Mhm.
that also has an impact. In fact, I'm going to roll to the next question
Do
here.
you mind if I pause there a moment, though? I want to almost put a bow on all these loose things we've done a little bit, or at least believe it will. Is you're right. You hit on something about how you envision things and how it gets done.
Right,
Simply put, you do have to have a long-term vision
right.
because for a couple different reasons. One is it gets you to where you're going. That's the clearest answer. The other thing is some elected official bodies will be more excited about this item than another one. So you have to be continually cognizant of which lever you can pull to get passage. If they're not interested in this, you're not going to get approval. You're going to have to wait till that elected body changes to a different makeup. You also have to understand, I know where I want the community to get to, so to speak. And so I have to change these sections of the ordinance,
Mhm.
which may get passed under this body or may not get passed, and you're waiting again, right? And it's knowing which mechanisms. Sometimes you go in by, whoa, I didn't anticipate all those spears coming at me. And
Mhm.
what I say is, it's it's like keeping like 10 different things active at once on a burner. I can advance this one right now because it's politically acceptable. I have to pause this one, or I need to change this section because that's what's important now. Forget the politics. This is important. The community is really pushing on this, or we need this change right now because something's happening, or you see something on the horizon.
Uh-huh.
And I say that to kind of just, you have to be very cognizant, I guess. And there's a little bit of a political astuteness, political tact, but then it's understanding like, if you want your community to be whatever it's going to be at the end goal, you're going to have to do lots of different things. Sometimes you're changing the zoning ordinance. Sometimes you're changing the town code. Sometimes you're changing the subdivision regulations. Sometimes you're creating something brand new, right? So it really is, and maybe that's the uniqueness of the field is, you're doing a lot of different things to get buy-in because you have public hearings. You do have elected bodies. You have, your city manager may say, not under my watch. I'm not letting that happen. That's too much of a lightning rod. I'm not going to get fired over that. I mean, that's pretty drastic, but, they might get some, skin
Sure.
off their back from political capital. So I say there's a lot of moving parts in the field if you want to achieve community. And I think that's where we're always trying to almost, I think it's where sometimes you feel wore down, going back to that discussion,
Mhm.
because you know what the big picture looks like and you want to get there. It's human nature, but you have to work these things. But I wanted to put those all in kind of perspective.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, the other thing that I was kind of thinking about as you were kind of saying this is, speaking of like having 10 things on 10 different burners, is, you know, there are those visions that you want to accomplish, but then there's the administrative roles on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
That just takes away your time. Sometimes you're like, wow, I just spent all day kind of like sending emails,
Correct.
and those emails, it's not saying that those emails were not important, but it's just you just find yourself sending emails all day.
Well, and let me just go there one quick second. I think, for some viewers who may not work at a small office, is that, when you work at a small local planning office, and I mean, I guess we probably beat this into the ground, but I mean, Rashidul is the master plan implementer. He
Uh-huh.
is the zoning code compliance person who reviews zoning permits and who reviews where fences are at and who reviews where the pools are going to go at and the additions and has to sign those plats. And the next day he's reviewing plans for a major development. And then he's getting a call that says, hey, you know what? I heard you made a decision on one of those zoning code things. Like, why can't they build their fence? You're like, well, it's in an easement in a floodplain. It's got to be out of there. Oh, I get it. Right. And then there's these emails of, it, who knows what on a daily basis, right? And so, as you're discovering, and we've talked about, sometimes if you really want to achieve things in local government and have your impact, you do it on your own time, quite frankly. I mean, when I talked about the historic design guidelines,
Yep.
if I wrote 20 hours of that in my office and it was probably a 100-hour project, they were at my kitchen table.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you on that as well. And as you know, I've been working on the wayfinding program, and most of my progress has been, on weekends when I had to analyze all that data, and the presentation element of it, I did it after work.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're just too tired to work on weekends, right? So you just take an extra 2 hours after work and you get things done. We're getting into nitty gritties.
Yeah.
I don't know how most of our audience is going to take that, but it's just, the thing is, if I really have to put a bow on it, it's basically, the way I describe it. The best thing about working in local government is you get to wear multiple hats. The worst thing is you get to wear multiple hats, right? Like
Absolutely.
that's been the struggle. Um, but I kind of did want to talk about COVID-19 because that's something, again, we didn't expect that we would be affected. Well, that's not fair to say, but it's just, the
Well,
impact
at
of,
a certain point, we didn't know it was going to happen, right?
yeah, at one point we were like, oh, that's not gonna happen to me, right? Like, but then it did, and now lo and behold, here we are. Um, and this is kind of like an inside knowledge. So Seth, this January, actually moved to Poolesville as the city manager, and while that has left a huge vacuum at Charlestown, I'm happy he's gone. Now I could to be the boss. I can be the boss now. But anyway,
How do you
joking.
like making those decisions and it being rested on you?
Yeah, but having said that, I don't think when you moved to Poolesville, we still had that COVID-19 scare. Like we were
No,
still
it hadn't happened yet.
happened to us, right? But then it did, and one thing that I felt, and at least we didn't keep in touch, particularly on this particular topic, but I got to know that pretty much the moment we kind of got wind of that this is going to be an issue, you pretty much quickly closed down City Hall, right?
That's correct. So once we identified that
Very
this
big
was
move. That's a very big move for the new guy, right?
correct, exactly. So lots of moving parts once again as a new guy as town manager, right? I've gone from community development director to town manager. And so clearly this came along and, hindsight's a little bit what hindsight is, we know what we know. But at the time it was uncertain, right? What was going to happen, how long, duration, what we should do, how we should do. And so made a decision that, for the safety and welfare of everybody, that we will close town hall and not allow the public in. But it also has a cascade of decision making. I had a town hall, I had a city budget ready to go, showing future increases in revenue
Mhm.
year over year. I had that you know, on this weekend, and then next weekend it was totally shot and had to take out a couple $100,000 to ensure that we didn't overspend,
Mhm.
take care of that. And so in that process, closing town hall, what I did with, I have, there's a, in my organization is there's a water treatment plant, there's parks and recreation, and then there are the folks who take care of the water and sewer lines that are outside the sewer plant area, basically everything underneath the roads. So the three sort of department heads there. What I did is I put everybody on a rotation so that we had teams of two that would rotate 2 times a week for 2 weeks, and then the third week they'd only be on one day, so that those two cohorts would stay together
Mhm.
2 times in that week and try to rotate. So what I did was try and split the staff down in such a way as I built pods. So if one pod got sick, hopefully it wouldn't get to the other ones, and that pod could keep operating, and then I had a third pod. So the goal was to have basically redundancy. So I split my staff up. Now what that required, or what that ended up happening, is 3 days a week. I didn't change anything with anybody's pay. So 3 days a week, people were at home getting paid on their full-time equivalency and working basically 2 days a week with their cohort that they were supposed to be with. And again, on that third week, they really kind of got lucky because, they only had to work 1 week one day that week and stay home. And we did that probably from mid-March until June 15th ish. And so, that's a big question. Like, wow, you're paying people to stay home, but what you're building, you're not. Yes, you are, but what you're building in is making sure you've got redundancy. That if a crew goes down, they can be plugged in, and that you're not going to spread across all the teams because while they're at home, maybe somebody else is getting it by accident at work, and so you have that backup. And the question becomes, and the other thing too is that bought masks for all the staff members. I closed the parks, took up the picnic tables, and put those back in the public works yard, so it was reduced group congregation. And we shut down the parks and the tot lot equipment within them. And what you have to understand about Poolesville, and this is a great thing from a planning perspective, one of the things that make me very excited to be there is we have great parks that are located near neighborhoods. They are parks that are surrounded by neighborhoods. They're not regional parks that you have to drive to. People can walk out their door and get there. And so they appreciate their parks. They love their parks because they're jewels. And there's tot lot equipment there. And then there's pavilions with picnic tables. And then there's good connectivity and sidewalks and trails where there's not sidewalks. And so everything is connected in town. We have a very walkable community. People actually walk. They walk their dogs. They get out. They do things. And so shutting down and then the other great thing from a planning perspective is we have a high school, an elementary school, a middle school, all within the town, not on campus-like settings, but are right next to residential developments. So it's a great planner's mix. And the point coming to the parks is shutting down the parks is a significant decision because it's such a daily part of their lives that they appreciate. Now, we allowed people to walk in the parks and do things in the park, but as there's people who say, COVID's COVID and I'll take my risk, and other people are very cautious. And so, there's some people who felt we should be able to make the decision whether our children play on the equipment or not. But we shut them down and put up signs. And, those are big decisions to take away an amenity that belongs to the community that they value. So we did act quickly so as to ensure that there wasn't spread in our community and that we could, help with suppressing the curve, right? That was the whole purpose, was to suppress the curve. And we did that and ordered, sanitizer and supply that we could. And of course, obviously that got challenging and, the great, toilet paper scare, right, of 2020, and we all had to deal with that. But we even limited the number of people who come into town hall that were out in the field, right? Our town hall is pretty slender because of the way we do business. There's 4 of us. To create fairness, I allowed some of those team members, to work from home as well during those days. So we acted pretty quickly because you just didn't know what was going to happen. And it's better to err on the side of caution and make sure that we don't spread this and be, accidental spreaders. And that's what we did. And actually today, town hall is still closed. My teams and guys seem to be pretty good. They're no more or less infected than the general, I shouldn't say infected. They're no more or less at risk than the general population. But, we've kept town hall closed because, public may want to pay their bills and some other things. But we have a drop box. We have everything else. In fact, I argue that in some ways, town government's never been better for the residents because we have a little drive that people can pull in off of in front of town hall. And it's never been better for them because it's almost like curbside to go for them. We bring out things, get them things, building permits, planning permits, zoning permits. Those things still all happen relatively easy. And they don't even have to come into town hall. We meet them at the door. Right. That was some fundamental decisions, right? It's nobody knew what was happening. There was obviously a scare, but when you take a public amenity from town hall, again, which belongs to the people, right? We're public servants, and their parks, those are some pretty substantial decisions, because the community owns those, and so that's how we reacted, and that's how we handled it. And today we're still not having in-hall meetings in town hall. We're still doing everything virtually via Zoom. Our town commission and all our other boards are still not meeting collectively.
So is town hall still closed to the public as of now?
Yes, it's still closed.
Okay.
And I think what I'm going to wait for, if I can get the timing, is let's see what happens in November, December, to make sure that due to cold weather and other things that this doesn't spike,
Mhm.
along with the flu, right? I mean, you have flu, do you have COVID, right? That's going to be the challenge.
When you make these very drastic decisions, right? How does council take it? They kind of relying on you to kind of make the right call, or they're like, no, we need to talk about this. This is too drastic for us.
Sure, I communicated with what's the equivalent of our mayor, and I communicated with her at that time and talked about, the appropriateness level and how much, and I was able to get buy-in and feedback. And at that time, and still, the town council is supportive of it. There is this question about when will we open town hall now, like that's starting to happen a little bit.
Mhm.
They've left a lot of that in my hands, and so there was a lot of support up front and understanding of that. People had mixed feelings, like, is it really that serious? But as time went on, they realized it was a good decision. Now the struggle is, when do you reopen? Because there's COVID fatigue happening, whether we all like it or not, it's happening. And uh, I don't want to be seen as the town manager that's closed the public out, right? I want to be, understand that it's your building. You should be able to approach us. Going back to our discussions, you should be able to knock on our door and find me, right? um, that small government philosophy. And so that is becoming a little bit of a challenge of what's the appropriate time. I'm being asked to take picnic tables back out to the pavilions, um, because school's starting, and some of the parents have lunch times with their kids, right? They have like an hour, so they may want to go right out their front doors, I discussed, to the pavilion and go to the picnic table, right? It's a struggle. Am I facilitating group congregation of multiple parents, even though they're doing the separation of space by 6 feet? I don't know who was there an hour beforehand and could have had COVID and coughed on that table. Now there's young children eating on there. You know, that's a struggle, right? I mean, am I facilitating the potential spread, or is there a certain point where if you're going to have your children there, you might have to bring your your Clorox wipes, right? And that's really kind of becoming a little struggle for me to find that balance. What I'm relying on, we're in Montgomery County, which has been very conservative to open up and push the ball too far. So I can, say, look, the county's not doing this. We shouldn't be ahead of the county. They have a health department. They have health officers there. They have the expertise. We should follow them because they have that. And
Mhm.
so that's really what I've done. But they put their picnic tables out, right? And it's funny that these things become emblematic of decision making as a picnic table, right? But it's part of a bigger discussion. So more than likely I will, but it's those decisions, right? That you kind of struggle with. You own those decisions, right? I said you're the boss now, Rachel, but you get to own those decisions, right? I'm in the same boat too, right? I have, why didn't he open those? Because some people are gonna say we shouldn't do this at all. I'll have supporters there, and I'll have other people say no. So we reacted quickly. We took it seriously. We implemented things and tried to keep help with suppressing the curve.
And maybe there's an honest conversation to be had regarding how does that have an impact on the economy, right? On
Mhm,
your local businesses. Like you also want to be mindful of that. I
mhm.
can't imagine it being an easy decision, but you kind of almost go with your gut feeling right now. But like again, I'm kind of realizing that as well, is that yeah, I really want everyone to be safe, and the best way to be safe is to stay at home. But there are certain things that kind of need to be done at at workplace.
Well, and you can't hold life in suspension at the end of the day, right?
Exactly. I think that's what I was kind of driving in, bringing along with the fatigue. That's the other thing. But if I'm honest with you, I feel like now that school's gonna open, it's probably gonna have an impact. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a kind of like a spike in the numbers. I know in UNC Chapel Hill, when they started school this semester, almost within a week they started having clusters all over their
Mhm.
place, campus. And within that week, they kind of had to close everything down. um you know it's
Maybe
a
this may segue to where you wanted to finish a little bit. Is that the struggle with those, right? Are you had a spike, and a lot of those people are healthy, but are positive, right?
Mhm.
And as with any, well, you and I have talked about this, right? You come from, your father's a doctor, right? You're going to have a lot of people who test positive, but show
They're
bare minimum symptoms, never going to go to the hospital.
yeah.
And you have that percentage that's going to get really sick. And there's a truth that there's going to be even a smaller percentage who pass away, right? And we're not going to minimize any of that. Those are all valuable. But how do at what point do you go from suppressing this? Because that was the whole purpose, right? It wasn't to cure it, it was to suppress it. And eventually the virus is going to do what the virus is going to do, right? Barring a vaccination, is even if we get out in slow, small pods, it's going to go from person to person, right? We've just now allowed it to amplify again because we're putting people back together. I guess my point is, whether it be a trickle, if you got 10 gallons of water and you let out as a trickle or a faucet and turn it open, it seems like it's going to happen no matter what. The question becomes, is there a place for you at the hospital so you can get the proper care? Because there's a certain element here that I wonder if I'm waxing a little bit and talking philosophical and talking kind of across medical and reality, is the virus isn't going to say, you're all inside, I'm not necessarily going to stop. I mean, it's going to go from person to person eventually in some fashion, barring a vaccination. So do you just, and I don't really want to get into the discussion, I even necessarily want to believe in the herd mentality. That's not what I'm pushing towards. It's pushing towards, is eventually everybody going to get it, barring there's no vaccination. And so do you open the gates and let it happen? Because at the end of the day, 3% are really going to get sick in some fashion. That we're going to get sick at some point, more than likely. It's just at a trickle. You have a high number, but this number is going to remain constant in terms of 3% of any population is 3%. They're going to get it because it's bound to spread, right? Now we want to make, I'm all cautious on this. I mean, I haven't touched when I pump my vehicle's gas, I haven't touched that handle without a glove since March. I've worn my mask everywhere I go. I have hand sanitizer all over my truck. I even joked about how often I wash my hands at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm cautious about this. It's not that element. And I'm just going to kind of pause here, is that whole suspension, right? I mean, if people are more than likely bound to get it, what do we do, right? I mean,
Right.
do we let the cats out of the bag, or do we let them out one at a time? I struggle with it because I want to protect. Look, you saw what I did with my own community.
No, that's what.
It's not a lack of that. It's understanding at what point do we realize the number's going to be sky high, but they are almost quasi meaningless,
Right.
because only a few people get sick.
I mean, for me, I think at the end of the day, it's more like, there is a fatigue there, right? Initially people were like crazy into kind of cleaning everything. Now they're not going to do that. But I think the least you can do is still kind of try to practice good hygiene, right?
Yes.
I mean, let's be honest, wearing a mask in public is going to be a thing for a moment. I mean, just a few days, I don't know. I think today I saw this doll, right? Like, those Raggedy Ann dolls that people make, out of cloth. And that one had a mask on. And I'm like, it's a thing, it's part of your culture, not culture, part of the kind of the experience now. So being careful is necessary. I think where I kind of feel a little bit frustrated is sometimes people's attitude of like, I don't believe in it. And I think I have less tolerance for that. Like I said, I mean, I understand that as well. Like, if you're kind of destined to be affected by it, you're kind of destined to be affected by it. Does that mean that you kind of have to be reckless about it as well? And I think that's where my frustrations are coming.
And I think that's that gray area, right? The recklessness, right? That's probably a good term to use, because the question is opening schools reckless or not, right? If people follow proper hygiene and they wear their mask, I mean, it's hard to social distance on a campus. I get that.
Yeah.
But if you take my school of thought a little bit, which may or may not be correct, is that it seems like people are bound to get it, the destined, right? if you can implement those things that are safe practices and realize that, we kind of got to come out of the box somewhere,
Yeah.
then maybe that's the way to do it. But I'm all with you on the proper hygiene, and I agree with you. Like, the not believing in it. I mean, you can't not. People are dying from it. It's like the anti-vax thing, right? I mean, as much as I understand and want to appreciate personal responsibility, your right to do what you want to do, right? The things that we dearly hold, you know, I'm not even going to make the argument of community benefit for the sake of discussion. It's just that, we've spent so much of our time in human history trying to find health and cleanliness, and now we're turning our back on it. After years of advancement, that just doesn't make sense to me, right? I mean, they say the mask itself, all the mask does is stop the particles going further, right? They all admit, unless you have a certain type of mask, you're not really truly stopping the spread. You're stopping how far it travels. And the closer it is to you, or it gets stuck on your mask a little bit, the less particles there are, right? I mean, that's the benefit of the mask. Nobody's saying that mask is going to stop COVID, right?
Exactly. Sure. Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? I mean, they say you wearing a mask isn't really going to be protected if somebody over there isn't wearing one. It's the community benefit. And so, maybe I am somewhat going back to the community impact here a little bit. And I think you're seeing my philosophical struggle of, if it's going to go run like wildfire at some point, at a slow burn or a fast burn, what do you choose? But that's not to say we need to throw out safety methods in terms of mask distancing, washing hands, hand sanitizer, and the like.
Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of the crux of my, if really there's a frustration is, um, look, I mean, I wash my hands every time I cook, right? Like before, after, not before and after, like almost in between, like any step, I do that. I just got better at doing it, like, that kind of like 20-second rule, right? Like I just made that a habit. So those are certain things that you want to do. And maybe at the end of the day, there's no clear statistics to kind of support or negate, the COVID as a issue. Um, all I can say, it is an issue,
Mm-hmm.
and good for you if you're not getting affected by it or impacted by it. But the reality is people are, and
Mm-hmm.
I just now on a personal level know some people who have been affected, you
Right.
know. Um, so, for me, it's not you could debate which one can make you safer, what method could be safer, but I find it hard to debate it being an issue, if that makes sense to you.
Well, I agree with you. Yeah, I don't think the debating of the issue of whether it's real or not is, for the average public, a legit thing. There are people who certainly don't believe in this, right? I get that. Then it comes down to what you and I are talking about. What level do you reopen, right? Because, as I sort of alluded to earlier, the goal wasn't to necessarily stop this. It was, I mean, literally, it was, is there a hospital bed for you? As
Mhm.
draconian as that sounds, that was the whole thing. Can
Right,
we find you a hospital bed?
right.
Not that that is necessarily a sign of success, and I don't want to take any viewers think that is what I'm anticipating. But we hear a lot about all these positive test cases, and you're right. I mean, we're going to get a lot of them, but I think what the struggle is for the public is there's a bazillion people who are testing positive, but they're walking around normal. In some ways, it negates people feeling threatened, right? Um, and so I think, and that's certainly not to say we shouldn't be doing testing. It's just there's a certain irony here. Is we know somebody, you and I, sick for what, 4 or 5 days and back to healthy, right? The average person goes, yeah, I can be sick for 4 to 5 days, instead of like seeming like I have to hide, I have to put, even if you wear the mask, right? Like you and I do. But then people like who are less sensitive than you are, like, do I really need this hand sanitizer? Do I need to do this? So I'm not sure what point I'm making other than the fact that, a lot of people don't get sick extensively. It's going to be released slowly anyway through a slower spread, and it really is about the capability. Do we have enough ventilators? Do we have enough medical things for you, and those sort of things? So how slowly do we rip the Band-Aid off, I guess, is really the question. And I
Yeah,
think that's probably the crux of this, right?
probably. Yeah. Yeah.
In some ways, because we said we can't hold life in suspension.
Hmm. Yeah.
So what level of realization that, if we slow it a little bit, right, there's going to be less severe cases over a longer duration versus a significant spike of severe cases, right? It's whether 100 people get sick all at once or they get sick over 6 months.
I was gonna think. So it's kind of like, you know how radioactive isotopes have a life. What's
Yeah,
the half life? And over a certain time, the kind of the impact or the potency of it kind of reduces. Some have longer half life, some have shorter. And I think that's how I was kind of looking at it. Probably you're gonna have cases, but as long as you're kind of, like they've expressed, slowing down the curve,
mm-hmm.
right? And that was kind of the target. I don't know whether we've kind of met that target. I'll admit that maybe considering where Charlestown is located and how close it is to, Maryland and Virginia, then rest of West Virginia, we've kind of been okay. We haven't had drastic cases, but the general idea was to kind of slowing down the curve, where at one point, it does stop being a major issue. Uh, but you know what? We're gonna kind of wrap up this one
Yeah,
because I
sure.
went through kind of a lot of, COVID-19 is gonna be a conversation for
I would
quite
agree
a
with
few months, no doubt about that. And you're gathering new information as you go, right?
you.
So,
Right.
we're not there yet where we can talk about it in hindsight, probably.
No.
But as I guess my message to everybody would be, be careful, be safe, and just exercise proper hygiene. One thing that I just wanted to talk about, and we're really wrapping up, but something that the way I kind of wanted to end this conversation, was finding common ground. If I'm not mistaken, you and I were of two different walks of life and political beliefs.
That's
Um,
true.
um, but here we are, we're talking, we spend almost 2 hours talking about certain things. And one of the reasons we were able to talk about so many things is because as when we worked together, we had our moments where we disagreed, but we for the most part did have a very good working relationship. Like there were moments where you and I kind of had a moment or two, right? But overall, if I have to kind of say that how we worked, I do feel like we worked as a team,
I would
considering
absolutely agree with that.
different walks of life. From the outset it might seem like, well, these two are not going to get along together, but in a weird way, like we kind of did get along pretty well. And the reason I say is not just because we had a friendly, good relationship, but I think some good things came out of it as
Yeah.
well, work wise. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to touch base on
Well,
that.
and I think the reason that it worked out is that the important thing and the underlying thing here, simple as this: we could consider and respect each other's views even if we disagreed upon it, and tried not to get emotional about it. And in fact, you and I both several times came back to work the next day and said, I thought about things a little bit more. This is kind of more what I meant, or wait, I understand a little bit more what you mean. And I put that together in this thing. And it wasn't about you had to be right, I had to be wrong. And sometimes we can agree to disagree. And I think that's part of this big issue, right? Is just listening without needing to be automatically like, this is my side. You can't, I'm going to convince you. It wasn't that. It was, let me hear the minutia of your discussion. We can agree to disagree. That's an interesting point. I can take and learn from that. I can think from that, right? That's really why I believe that even though we come from different walks of life and different, philosophical perspectives, you know, we could get along because that key element was there. We weren't going to try and convince each other. We were going to explain our points in a respectful, logical, reduced emotional environment in which we could express those, right? Uh, I think that's the key. And in some ways, I think that's part of the loss of discussion in our broader thing. And I'll say one last thing to this. It's always easy in the abstract to have real strong feelings. In the abstract, it's really easy not to like something or to like something. But once you interface with somebody personally, you know, it's not some nebulous they, it's a human being before you that you're communicating with, and you're
Mhm.
trying to respect and understand them, right?
Mhm.
uh, in that interpersonal relationship element, right? And we can learn from each other. But yes, I think that's why to me it worked.
Yeah, no, I do agree, and it's it's funny you use the word respect because that's something that I mentioned in my interview, right? Like there was
Yes,
I forgot what the actual question was, but it maybe like what do you expect from this town? Like what are your expectations? Maybe that was the question, and I said respect, and not because I demand it, I want to earn it, but I'd like to start from that, that level of respect. And I think that's what I said in the interviews. Like, I'm willing to listen to you. I'm willing to hear your side of the argument, as long as we're kind of going through that channel of respect and we're not being dismissive of each other. You know,
correct.
even when we work together, there are moments where we both got emotional about certain things, but like you said, the very next day we come back, and maybe because we're both passionate about this field, where we were like, okay, I need to think about it a little bit more. You take it home, you kind of take that conversation home, and you come back, and I remember that one particular example where it was funny because you were just walking in front of my office space, and I said, hey, here's my thought on this thing that we disagreed on yesterday, and you were also like almost to the dot, like saying, this is what I came to talk to you about. And I found it interesting that before and hi and a hello, we were both thinking about it pretty much.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that we were both thinking about it on our way to work.
Hmm.
The moment we saw each other, we were like, all right, let's talk about it, and we did. And I think, again, it's one of the situations where I do appreciate that whenever we did find ourselves on the opposite side of a discussion, we were respectful enough to kind of work it out,
Hmm.
not at the cost of our ego or sense
That's
of whatever. And I kind of try to carry that as I try to work here at this point,
well, and I'm sure you'll carry it forward anywhere you go because that's your personality trait. And I will say, and I think you know it's funny. I'm being candid in what's going to be shared with everybody is that I would hope that you keep that anywhere you go because it's very easy to get sucked into the emotional environment we live in and get set in your ways
Mhm.
because it's so built into our environment that you know I'm right no matter what. I'm going to become emotional over the issue because it's all around us instead of this higher level of civility. Yeah, and I'm sure you will because that's in your nature. That's in your thought process. You want to at least understand. That's what I always like, and that's what I try to understand from you as well. And you're right. I do remember that in the interview. There's certain things that if you interview people, it's weird that you know there's certain triggers. And I was like, yeah, I can appreciate that, right? And
Mhm.
it was, and I think the question probably was like, how do you handle a difficult situation? How do you handle something you don't disagree
Right,
with?
right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No.
Yeah, how you just and it's like as long as I'm heard out respectfully, right? And there's things like that's a deep statement, really. I mean, it's simple, but it's deep. Like look, I can go along as long as I'm respectfully heard. And I'm like, what? Well, hopefully he does the same because this is the type of person I'd want to work with, right?
Yeah, and actually, to your point, yeah, because I think that's what it was about. Like, you are gonna hear my opinions, you are gonna hear
Mm-hmm.
me speak out on certain things, but I'm also kind of a team player, and I think that kind of gave the message, if I'm not mistaken, that I'm not gonna be your yes man,
Correct.
but I'm also not gonna be that guy that just like is here to change the world and kind of like giving the finger to everybody else. But it was like I'll have my opinions, but I also understand what setting that I'm working on, and we'll work it on. But the foundation of it was supposed to be respect.
And I hope and I guess this comes with my management style a little bit. And this is how I perceive myself. I mean, I like to be a little bit collaborative, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I know other people have good ideas, and maybe we can merge those together. You know, I merged several different ideas together. I had
Mhm.
one component, you had something else. I'm like, oh, that's good, right? It's, and I
Right.
guess as a boss and an employer and somebody in management is that, you know, I want to hear those things because they might help me make a better informed decision, right? You know,
Right.
it's easy to get again. It's easy to get into that. I have all the answers. I'm in the boss seat, right? This is
Right.
what we need to do. But sometimes, like, wait, there's different ideas. There's different ways to go about this. It could be better, right? And so, you know, I really try to strive for that collaboration because I've appreciated that as an employee, right? You know, I don't forget that at one time I mean, of course I'm always an employee. I always have somebody to answer to, but the higher up you go, it gets a little different, right? I don't forget that at once I was an employee who wanted to be heard and valued, and my opinion taken into consideration. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I try to do that with other people as well.
No, and I get it, and it's funny. I mean, I don't know if this is the right expression right now, but you've played a mentorship role in my professional career. But right now, I'm in a situation where basically you were, I don't know, 2 years ago, maybe,
Yeah,
right?
prior to you.
So it's interesting, kind of seeing certain things where, again, I feel like those are certain things that I've kind of taken from your guidance. Is again, hearing people out and trying to find a solution. I mean, you could easily, based on my role and my kind of job responsibility, you could easily hide behind that. This is what the code book says, and end of story. If you have a problem with it, go to the BZA. And there are moments where I do feel like doing that, and I've almost done that as well. Let's just say, because clearly we're not having a conversation or working things out. But even if I feel like that, at the back of my head, I'm like, well, no, all right, let me figure it out. Let me find a solution. Let me try to find a common ground. And I think I kind of took that from you. But also, one of the things that I'm also taking in is sometimes you just kind of have to make decisions on your own,
Hmm.
and you're gonna regret it sometimes. And when I say regret, it's not like it's the end of the world for you, but it's just like it's gonna kind of haunt you for a while, right? And and this is where I'm going to give you some compliment, is although I always kind of express my displeasure for doing code compliance, and I've been very vocal about my displeasure about that particular part of my job, that you kind of had to kind of calm me down by giving me stuff that I actually like doing. Like, that was your tactic. But my point is that the whole code compliance thing, the good thing, if any, that came from it was having a much more kind of like a resolution in terms of certain decisions. I'm like, this is the way it is. It is the way it is. You hate me for it. I understand that. I respect that. Go to the city manager or whoever is higher up to kind of make that complaint. But I know where my decision is coming from, and it's nothing personal. It's coming from a certain place of logic, and I could totally understand you not agreeing with me on it. So that's something that I took, and I think it would be very difficult if I didn't go through that process, right?
Hmm.
It would be very difficult for me to kind of appease all my constituents, right?
Well, and
Because
I think the code, in some ways, you know, as you developed, you know, and we're all developing, right? Even myself today, you know, that probably really was a good experience for where you find yourself today. But even as growth, right? At least code compliance is, you know, for your viewers, if they're even still with us, but you know, is that code compliance is black and white. You can't have tires in your yard. You can't have gutters falling off your house. You know, these are, it's not a lot of black and white. It's pretty clear. You either are or not certain things. You either have vehicles with no license and tags, or you do. And so when somebody argue, let's use grass. You know, grass can be taller than 10 inches. When you pull up the grass and it's 2 feet tall, and they're trying to tell you, oh no, it's 6 inches, and you've got a measuring tape on its face, everything is true except their statement. So what happens is you have to, like you're saying, what it did for you as you grow is like you have to directly say to somebody, and this takes a lot of growth and development, and be like, I'm sorry. It is a clear violation. There's no arguing about this. You can go to the court, the municipal court, and deal with it. You can go to the city manager, but I'm now giving you a warning and then a violation. And once you get a violation, it's got to go to municipal court. I'm like, you can't say that I don't have tires in my yard and I have a picture of it, right? And so part of it is people are like, wow, that's ludicrous, but people make those arguments. But what it does for you is it requires you to do probably the most challenging thing with human behavior nature is to go to somebody on their property, on their home, which in America is a very big private domain and a very huge right, and tell them that they're doing something wrong and do it in such a way that it's with tact, it's the best you can without them getting upset. And in saying like, look, this is a warning. You've got 7 days to take care of this. And so really it forced you out of City Hall, get out in the public, deal with something challenging, because basically you're saying no to everybody. You can't, there's no gray there. There's no making that happen, right? I mean, we're not going to say, oh, you're a good person, we're leaving your tires there. You know, so you were able to grow in like this crash course essentially.
Yeah.
And now when you are confronted with gray areas, you know, that started you up from a black and white, very clear. You didn't have to make a lot of interpretations. Now that you do, you can kind of sense, you know what, from my code experience, this was black and white. I'm comfortable. This is gray. I will solicit information, right? And so it helped you develop.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that's what happened. That's the kind of the basis of it. Is like it gave you a foundation of kind of separating the bullshit from
yeah.
what is an issue, just being able to do that. But right now I'm going through another crash course, which is basically trying to live under your shadow of what you've done for this town and
I'm sorry there.
how Rashidul is not a good planner and he's like being difficult. Which I think, you know, on a personal level, I'm like, I've already resorted to the fact that, look, you spent what? Together 8 to 10 years under this city, right? I'm never going to do much. But what I can do, and this is what I try to do, is there are certain things that I learned from you that I feel like was very apt and kind of like really a custom built for this town and understanding how this town works. And I've kind of taken that in, and I kind of try to apply that in my work, sometimes with success, sometimes without success. But what I'm trying to do right now, though, is really trying to make my own decisions. Like even when you were there, even if I made a decision, right? I had the luxury of like, you know, somebody not being happy with my decision, say on code compliance, and they're calling you. And you know, kind of like, you know, this guy that you hired, this is what he did. Now that's not really happening. I mean, I still have the city manager kind of above me, but some of these decisions kind of have to be mine. And that's the role that I'm trying to kind of fit into, is kind of owning up to decisions. And that's what you'll notice, that sometimes I do not reach out to you because I'm like, it's nothing against Seth. It's just I have to be confident in making those decisions, because at the end of the day, I kind of have to live with them, right? So it's only where I'm like, okay, I really can't figure this one out. I need to talk, that I reach out to you.
And definitely feel comfortable reaching out to me. And you know, I think it's, if from your defense, it's unfair, you know, and it happens. We've all been in these situations, and so fact, it's a little unfair for them to compare you to me, you know, for a host of reasons, right? I mean, I'd spent, you know, 5 years in Jefferson County getting to know people before I went over to Charlestown, you know, and when I was at Charlestown, I had 9 years of experience in, you know, county and local government. I mean, you were at like 18 months. Throw you to the wolves, Rachel. Enjoy. You know, you haven't had the opportunity to build the network of people. You know, we interfaced a lot together with them. You know, but you hadn't had the years of experience on some like zoning elements, right? We were still coming together on some of those things and working together, and you getting comfortable there. So, you know, from a peer standpoint, you know, I see why they do it, but of course it's unfair to you because, you know, it's just a different level, right? It's not that you can get there and you will. It's just we're just at two different perspectives.
Yep.
And you do a great job, and I tell people all the time, you know, with what you've been thrown in 2 years of experience, it's significant, right? I mean, it's a lot. It really is. It was a challenge for me, as I told you, And when it was just because you have Stephanie and yourself, I had Trey and myself, and then I was able to pull you in. And that was a lot with my experience and me willing to work 10, 11, 12-hour days, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's not a totally, fair comparison. I heard this quote one time, and I always think about it is, you don't want to be the person who replaces the popular person. You want to be the person who replaced the popular person, right? Because you basically want to be the third person in line.
Mhm.
The person who replaces the popular person, not that I was popular, please don't get that impression, but liked or whatever, right? It's hard to be the person who is the first person to replace the person who is liked
Mhm.
because you live in that shadow. Oh,
Mhm.
they're not so and so. So that second person always just takes this unfortunate beating. The third person is where you want to be. Like, oh, you know,
Right, right.
they've gone through that emotional change. Like, oh, change is going to happen, and you're never going to get the first person back again, right? They're gone.
Yeah.
Your expectations devalued with the second one. They leveled back to normalcy as the third. But I know you're capable and skilled, and I've said that to you 100 times. I mean, you'll do great.
No, I mean, and like I said, um I since January, like this, let's just say 9 months, right, have been, in a weird way, I can say you would have been very proud of how
Mhm.
far I've come.
Yes.
Um, it comes from some of the things that I learned from you, but also something that I always felt grateful that you felt that way was, in many ways, you had more confidence in me than I did on myself. And I remember you telling me at one point, like, Rashid, if only you had the confidence on yourself the way that I do,
Mhm.
I was like, okay, so all right, so I know this is not a guy who's gonna say something just for the sake of saying something.
Mhm.
Certainly, he feels
Yeah.
that, and I think this 9 months kind of showed where you were coming from.
Yeah.
Where your kind of faith was
Right.
in my capabilities. Um, because like I said, sometimes certain decisions I'm like, I know this is how Seth would do it, but I'm gonna do it this way.
Sure.
Not out of disrespect for Seth, but it's like I can have to make this call this certain way. But on this but the on the other side, it's also like kind of like understanding how things work, how things play out in this town came from you, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of like striking that balance of finding my own ground and kind of continuing the legacy that has been, that's the other thing about planning that I often don't get to talk about. You're building on others, progress. Like I'm building on you built on somebody else, somebody built on, like you're just kind of adding to that whole kind of chain of events, right?
Let me piggyback on that for one quick second. That's one thing we didn't touch about in here is, really the planning, if you put your heart and soul in it, like some of the things I did and talked about, is that, heart and soul, I guess, loose, but um, I'm saying that you don't have to always do that. You have to just, be there. But the planning is great because I expressed this about Lebanon, Tennessee. I get to go back and see all these sidewalks put in different places and the network, right? I get to know that we've, preserved certain things in Charlestown, right? Like I know some of the things we've done together, our legacies we're leaving. Like they may never know who we are or what we did, but we can say we've done something for community, right? That's a great feeling. That's a great thing, I'm very proud of having been able to mentor you and Liz. I mean, it's a great sort of thing. It's a great feeling, and I hope you get to have it one day. Because it does feel good. But it's also great that within that, all the good things we did together to create community. It's in code, right? Now somebody has to make a very deliberate effort to remove that, right? That's hard,
Right.
and so it's great to be able to say, like, look, I've self-actualized, I've met that at the community, I've done these great things, I've built great relationships, we did good things. I won't even see the fruition of things I wrote in code. Other people are going to see them, that building the foundation. I'm just glad it's happening. I don't need the credit. I just want to build good community, and that's always kind of what I've been about. But yeah, I mean, I guess there's a part of the ego, right, that says, what have I done with my life? What have I achieved?
And I'll add to this because I talked to my professor back from Bangladesh, and I just talked to him that, sometimes because of the stress of the job and just kind of how things play out, you forget to celebrate the little wins, right?
Yeah.
Like when you were talking about code, I was thinking, well, it's interesting, but I do have some of my illustrations there, right?
Mhm.
If I was in a bigger uh, town or a city, chances of having something that I prepared being incorporated into the zoning ordinance would be very slim. But I had that opportunity here. I helped you with certain, developing or getting information on certain things that you kind of made to code. So you forget to realize that, or just on a daily basis, you're kind of
Well,
moving the needle forward,
and
right?
for you, Rachel, I mean, your renderings are the backdrop of the town's website on a bunch of pages, right? I mean, I think they may have posted your renderings potentially on the website of how development infills could be built, right? I don't know if they ever posted that, but if it's not, you should anyway. That's the other thing working in local government. Sometimes you can just do and not ask for permission. But seriously, I mean, we'll kill this a thousandth time, but I know people who've worked in big planning organizations. They submit their staff report to a deputy director, and then maybe the director reviews it, and then the finance department reviews it to make sure the fiscal impacts have no created issue. Then the legal department. We're lucky to get things out at 5 o'clock on a Friday and sent out in an email, and we're the only ones who've reviewed it and did the staff report, right? So, it does
Not
allow.
too much about checks and balances, though.
No, it goes to the board. They're the check.
But no, see, what was going to add to that? Well, I really felt an impact um, when Liz, and
Mm.
hopefully when time permits, she'll be part of this conversation in a different podcast because, she's been a very valuable member to this community. But when she took that initial watercolor that I did for the
Mm.
cityscape and kind of used it for the car show, and for me, I was like, yeah, whatever, Liz, I'm fine with it. But what I loved is when I was walking down that street and I'm looking at every sticker, every I don't know, whatever,
It
having
branded the event.
wow, this whole street is filled with that illustration in different formats, but it's there. I mean, I love looking at it as a sticker on a car and the hood was open. It was just on top of the engine or something, wherever. I'm like, that's cool.
And
And
we're
just
talking about postcards for the viewers. And what happened is Rachel ended up in a contest, a Facebook contest too. I mean,
so
you
fun.
missed that huge part, right? Like you and somebody else who's well recognized in the community, went toe to toe on this contest, and you pulled forward, and that branded the event. And it's a cool watercolor. It ended up on a postcard, and like I said, it got displayed on things. It was the brand of the event, and so it
Yeah.
does feel good to be able to do that. And you're right. You think in any town over a population of 55,000 that your little project would have been able to get that much traction, right? It's that's the great thing about being able to work local, right? I mean, you get the frustrations, but you get some of that really good excitement too, and the feedback.
Yeah, look, I mean, I kind of did want to wrap it up.
Sure.
It went overboard, but it's fine. Just wanted to say, how much I appreciate kind of the guidance you've given. And, I think I'm at a situation right now where I'm like, you know what, just kind of have to make your own decisions. And it's tough, right? Because sometimes you just want to call the next planner and be like, hey, because sometimes some conversations are just between planners.
Yeah.
Only a planner will kind of get where I'm coming from,
Right.
or if
Right.
you've really worked on this line for a long time. But sometimes you just need to be kind of confident and move forward. And I think that's my struggle right now. That's the kind of journey I'm on. Hopefully, I'll find myself being more confident in certain decision making. And yeah, like I said, I think you'd be very proud where I came so far. There's a long way to go, no doubt, but
The
it's
department's not on fire.
I mean, I say that
I
like
know that's your term.
I've done my job if I haven't sunk the ship, and it sounds so like depressingly kind of like negative, pessimistic, The reality is actually you've done a good job if you haven't sucked the shit. But anyway, look, so let's wrap up here. Like I said, appreciate the conversation, and who knows if we have another time, we'll talk about something more specific.
Yeah.
But I think we kind of did cover a good ground. I don't know if
I
people
think so.
are bored by it, but that's on them.
You never know.
But yeah, we'll just end it here.
Sounds good, Rachel.